Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. The Amazon is on fire. We've all seen pictures on TV screens and on social media as the green lungs of the planet are turning to ash. Now, all these visuals paint a doomsday scenario. Some might say that while the pictures might seem that way, talking about doomsday is a bit of an exaggeration. But when the world's largest and most essential rainforest catches on fire and trees are destroyed by the hundreds within minutes, it's not irrational to acknowledge that all our futures are in jeopardy. We take a closer look at what is unfolding. Joining us today is Grace Blakeley, economist and author of Stolen: How to Save the World from Financialization. Joining us from the UK, we're also joined by Mr. Svein Tveitdal, former UN climate expert, joining us from Helsinki. Thank you both for joining us. Before we move on with our discussion, let's take a look at a brief report.
Due to decades of rapid development and disregard for environmentally sustainable policies, the Earth's climate is changing and temperatures are gradually rising. As more and more greenhouse gases are being emitted and the global ecosystem becomes more vulnerable, the preservation of trees and forests is more critical than ever before. It has been more than 3 weeks now as fires continue to rage in the Amazon. Around the world, concern has turned into fear for what this means. Known as the lungs of the planet, the Amazon produces around 20% of the world's oxygen, while absorbing huge amounts of carbon dioxide. As the forest burns, however, instead of tackling carbon dioxide, it is releasing vast quantities of carbon into the environment. The satellite data from Brazil's space agency suggests it is burning so fast, trees are being cleared at the rate of 5 football pitches every minute. According to Brazil's National Institute for Space Research, more than 74,000 fires have been recorded this year. The fires this year mark a record high.
Mr. Tveitdal, now let me just begin with you. Given what's happening in the Amazon, and previously as well, we've always heard of massive deforestation that's happening there. But what's happening right now? Is this unprecedented?
Yes, it is. If we take a step back, in the last 40 years, the Amazon has lost approximately 20% of its rainforest. That is as much as the country of Turkey. Today, it, in a way, disappears faster than any time. And as you mentioned, this is the lungs of the planet. It produces 20% of the oxygen we use in the world. So if the Amazon is disappearing, I don't think we can live on the earth.
Right.
And researchers say that they have a tipping point. So if between 40 and 60% is disappearing, the rainforest may collapse. So that's why we need to stop this immediately.
Right. Now, Grace, jumping to you and talking a little about why it's happening. Now, an argument is to be made for the fact that as development goes on, this is the natural course of things. This is what we're seeing all across the world. So do you think that it is normal and this was expected?
I think what we have to remember is that what is going on at the moment is in no way an accident. This was a key part of Bolsonaro's election campaign, was to allow multinational corporations into the Amazon to be able to undertake effectively agriculture in the name of development. But this is part of a model of development that sees the role of multinational corporations as incredibly important. And for about 40 years now, we've had a very one-sided view of how development should work, which is essentially that developing countries, low-income countries, should open up their economies to foreign multinationals, to big businesses, to big banks from all over the world, and particularly from the global north, so that those companies can undertake development on the state's behalf. Now, there is no reason why these states should not be undertaking development projects by them on their own, by themselves, supported by international banks, supported by the global north. In a way that both promotes, the well-being of their people whilst also protecting the environment.
Right. But do you think that that support is happening at a global and international scale, where we are seeing support being given to these developing nations so that their development happens in more sustainable manners?
We are absolutely not seeing enough of that going on at the moment. The current international institutions that we have are completely unfit for the task of promoting and prioritizing sustainable development in the global south. You see, all over the world, many low-income countries simply unable to get the finance that they need, whether it's from the World Bank, whether it's from the IMF, to undertake sustainable development without making huge sacrifices in terms of their political platform, in terms of democracy, and being forced to impose quite regressive programs on their people, which then end up being very unpopular. What we really need is a global climate bank that actually transfers wealth from north to south, bearing in mind that the global north is responsible for the vast majority of historical emissions, in order to prioritize both adaptation to the reality of climate change and a reduction of emissions in the global south.
Right. Now, I'm just going to go back to Mr. Tveitdal and talk to him about everything that Grace mentioned here, how the economic system all across the board needs to be reworked. But now when we're talking about Brazil and Bolsonaro's government, it's facing a backlash for whatever is happening in the Amazon. But do you think when we're talking about the support given to the government internationally by the other governments in the world, do you think there was enough support to actually protect the Amazon in the first place?
No. It was as the other lady said, that the support is not enough. I can take an example from Norway, because Norway has actually provided approximately $1 billion to Brazil to stop deforestation. And then we measure how the status is, and they don't get money if they don't have results. Now we have in Norway held back approximately $300 million awaiting this situation. And it is, to our information, quite clear that almost all of these fires are started by people that would like to have cattle or would like to have soya, and then Bolsonaro is not very eager on punishing these people. So in a way they're allowed to go ahead. And it looks like that is one of the major problems related to what we see just now. I also wanted just to inform people that rainforest is called rainforest because it produces its own rain. One tree in there can produce approximately 1,000 liters, pour it into the atmosphere every day. And it actually pours more water into the atmosphere, the whole forest, than the Amazon River pours into the Atlantic Ocean every day. So it's fantastic. But that's why we can talk about a tipping point, because if deforestation continues, this tipping point might come, and then we can see a fast collapse, maybe have desert or savanna.
Right. As Mr. Tveitdal, picking on that point, if we see fast deforestation, is this a global phenomenon? Deforestation happening at rapid paces. Is it happening all across the world? I mean, we're singling out the Amazon because of what we're seeing right now. But how is this playing out in the global scenario?
Well, it goes on in Congo. It goes, for instance, on in your part of the world, in Indonesia. But in Indonesia now, the pace of deforestation is slower, and it looks like the government would like to do something with it. So that's why it's so important to focus on what is happening in Brazil just now. And as you know, at the G7 meeting just in this weekend, Macron wanted to put this on the top of agenda because it is so important.
Right.
And it is necessary with an international cooperation, meaning giving them money and punishing Brazil if they don't do anything with it. That, in a way, is the way it can be started.
Right. So, Mr. Tveitdal, hold on to that point. Grace, I'm going to go back to you and talk a little about how this global system can be revamped and how necessary for it to be revamped. Now, all these developed nations are putting pressure on Brazil right now, but it is a part of a larger problem. What needs to be done? Policies that can actually be implemented and not just talked about.
Absolutely. I think, the first set of steps that we need to take is to acknowledge that the reason that a lot of these farmers and agriculturists are attempting to set the Amazon on fire is because they are attempting to secure a livelihood for themselves. At the moment, under President Bolsonaro, this may be the only way that they think that they can secure a livelihood for themselves. This may be the only way they think they can undertake agriculture. We need to be able to promote sustainable development in a way that prioritizes both people, including the indigenous people living in the Amazon, who Bolsonaro has consistently dismissed, as well as the planet. And this kind of idea of just and sustainable development and promoting a just transition to a zero carbon economy should be absolutely at the center of any plans to deal with what's going on. And what that really means is that we need a global Green New Deal. So at the moment, you might be hearing a lot about the Green New Deal underway in the US and in the UK, which would effectively be a big program of state spending aimed at both reducing inequality and promoting sustainability. So it would create lots of jobs, building green infrastructure, green energy programs, etc.
So Grace, let me just put sorry to interrupt you here, but a question that I'm sure a lot of people ask is that this Green New Deal sounds amazing, it sounds ideal, but how much of it can actually work when the main business motive is profit and there's cutthroat competition, and that's the system we've been living in for decades? How can that actually happen?
Exactly. And that is the system that needs to change if we're going to tackle climate change. There is no question that the current free market system is completely unfit to deal with the biggest challenge that humanity has ever faced. As long as we live in a system where profit is prioritized over the planetary good and over human lives, then we simply won't be able to deal with this challenge. And at the moment, that same logic is manifested in the international institutions that say, if you want a loan to deal with the climate crisis, then you must implement austerity. You must remove capital controls. You must allow multinational corporations to come into your country. It's simply not an appropriate way to be able to deal with these things, because you need to be able to implement programs that also command mass public support.
Right. Mr. Tveitdal, now we talked earlier about how what's happening is unprecedented, but just to get a more clear picture of what is happening. Now, it is the fire season in the Amazon. So how much of climate is playing into what's happening, and how much of it is being run by people who want to clear down the forest for agricultural purposes, for other business purposes?
As of now, it is topping up because the people is cutting the forest to produce cattle or produce soya, for instance, and it won't stop. I agree with Grace. Before it is the people that is cutting down the trees in a way makes more money if the trees are standing there than if they cut it down, because that is how the market is working. Right. So that means that internationally we need to provide them with more funding than now, but we also need to punish them if they are going ahead as they do now to cut and cutting down the forest. And so as you asked about whether it's climate change or whether it's the people living there that is, in a way, creating the problem. And on top of what is happening now, global climate change is putting a big pressure on the Amazon, and that is another threat to the forest. So it means that to save the rainforest, which is in a way, again, helping us to save the climate, we also need to reduce emissions and reach the goal of the Paris Agreement. All these things are very, very close connected, and it is starting to get very, very serious now, actually.
Right. And Mr. Tveitdal, that's a point I want to carry on forward. But before that, I just want to focus a little more about the indigenous community living within the Amazon and all the habitats. Give us a true sense of what is happening to them and what has been happening not just now, but for many, many years.
Well, I can take an example from there is a debate now, for instance, going on in Norway, because we have 100 Norwegian companies that are investing in Brazil, and some of them is investing in projects that might be threatening to the rainforest. And that means now that there is a big debate in Norway that these companies should withdraw from their business if they don't do it in a sustainable way. So also to the business society has a huge, big responsibility to solve the problem, but I think it's national politics that has to, in a way, set up the rules so that the companies are not allowed to go ahead with an unsustainable exploration of the forest in Brazil. It's complicated, but I think that's the way we have to do it.
Right. Now, Grace, what is the way forward when we're talking about reworking the system? And we've talked about what needs to be done, but when we just saw also in the G7 meeting, it's very difficult for countries to come to the table and actually agree about anything, yet alone make such a substantial effort to actually go against the system they've been working for so long. Now, what do you see happening in the near future?
I think a large part of the problem is that the states that are making most of these decisions are concentrated in the global north and have very little incentive, often, to make big steps towards actually tackling climate change. As long as it's just the G7, big countries like the United States run by Donald Trump, and now, the UK with Boris Johnson, they simply aren't going to prioritize the needs of the global south and actually the needs of the planet. Because climate change is going to end up harming countries in the global south and people in the global south far more than populations in large parts of the global north. What we really need is a multilateral system that works on the principle of one country, one vote, rather than what we have now, which is $1, one vote. And if we could get countries together in an international forum like the United Nations to actually agree to create an international climate development bank that would prioritize sustainable development in the global south and would use transfers from north to south, supported by greater wealth taxation, supported by an acceptance of capital controls at the international level and an agreement to constrain multinational corporations rather than simply allowing them to do whatever they want. That would be the start of a process that would allow us to get towards all of the environmental objectives that are set out in the Paris Accords that the IPCC have laid out as well. But it really does require international coordination between North and South, not just the global North telling everyone else what to do.
Right. Mr. Tveitdal, those points that Grace highlighted here. Now, she also mentioned the UN's role, but we see UN saying that these are the policies that should be laid out, making recommendations, but it can do very little to actually implement what's happening. And that's something that we're witnessing time again on various fronts, whether it's conflict or climate. Now, to that, what do you say? What do you see happening?
Well, I agree. I've been working many years in the UN, and they are not stronger than, in a way, the governments that are governing them. That's why they would very much like to do more, but they are not able to. Amazon now might be an eye-opener like the plastic was some time ago, that can trigger action. And I believe that what happens to the rainforest now might come quite high up on the agenda when the Secretary General has his climate meeting in New York shortly, and also on the COP25 in Santiago. I also would like to mention another issue, because what we have seen now, and that's back to the eye-opening, because the last week there has been so many people in Norway that as individuals would like to support, to protect the rainforest. There has been 10,000 of them that has given money to protect the rainforest, and that also would like to boycott companies that, for instance, is importing soya to Norway that is produced in an unsustainable way, or cannot prove that they have done this in such a way. So it is also extremely important, actually, what individuals can do to push the process. And the process is so important.
Right. Grace, just a last question to you before we end this segment here. Now, we were talking about a global cooperation in terms of governments, but what pressure needs to be put on those multinationals operating in these regions with ruthless policies and clear policies that are leading towards environmental degradation?
Yes, Stephen was absolutely right to suggest that what is required at the national level is a mobilization of people to put pressure on national governments to undertake some of these things. And the same thing needs to happen when it comes to multinational corporations. At the moment, too many multinational corporations effectively believe that they can operate above the law, that they can operate above the level of domestic regulation, and that they don't have to follow anyone's rules, that they can, move their profits all around the world so they don't have to pay tax, that they can degrade the environment, that they can kind of commit all sorts of financial crimes without ever being held to account. Now, that is something that national governments will have to work together to do. The states in which multinational corporations are headquartered, many of which are headquartered in the United States, have a unique responsibility to ensure that they are imposing domestic and international regulation on those corporations. And if they don't meet those regulations, they need to have fines or even, jail sentences or something more serious. You've started to see this now since the financial crisis with banking. So that big fines have been given out to banks like HSBC, for example, for having committed fraudulent activities, for money laundering, etc. And large fines are now starting to be imposed where wrongdoing has taken place. It took the financial crisis for us to start taking that seriously and actually working to clamp down on these things. Maybe this crisis is what we need to start clamping down on multinationals who encourage these activities.
Right. And that is something that everyone hopes for, that at least this incident that occurred now, that is continuing to unfold, is the necessary impetus needed for countries and governments and individuals to actually take a stand and make rapid actions towards protecting the environment. On that note, thank you so much, Ms. Grace Blakeley, for joining us from the UK, and Mr. Svein Tveitdal for joining us from Helsinki. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to take a closer look at President of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, and the global community's stance on what's happening in the Amazon. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. Now, President Jair Bolsonaro has changed his entire stance on how to deal with the fires raging in the Amazon. This comes after international pressure and possible threat of sanctions. But what has been happening ever since Bolsonaro came into power at the start of this year in terms of the Amazon? And will this crisis now be a lesson for Brazil's government and the governments around the world to take more strict action against environmental degradation? We focus on the details of this. Joining us now is Sven Harmeling, ex-global policy lead on climate change and resilience at CARE International, joining us from Bonn. We're also joined by Mr. Patrick Sullivan, analyst and chief executive officer of leading UK think tank Parliament Street, joining us from London, and Mark Meirowitz, analyst and professor at the State University of New York Maritime College, joining us from New York. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Harmeling, I'd like to begin with you. Now, given what we're seeing unfold and seeing how the international community is placing greater and greater pressure on Bolsonaro, do you think this will have a long-term impact on how Bolsonaro now takes the matter forward?
Yeah, I think, generally it's very important to see that this is this crisis in the Amazon region, these multiple forest fires, are in a way an opportunity because they raise attention to the issue and how important it is to preserve this important ecosystem, not only from a local perspective, but also from a very global perspective. And we see it as part of the bigger discussion around the implementation of the Paris Agreement on climate change, which many countries committed to, including the Brazilian government ratified the agreement. And it's very clear, without protecting the Amazon and the carbon that is stored there, it would be almost impossible to really implement the Paris Agreement and stick stick to the commitments. And we also see from many local people, local communities in the country and also in neighboring countries, for example, in Peru, where CARE is also working, how important it is to preserve the Amazon and the people within there. And I think there is an indication that this international public pressure helps raise attention to it and hopefully results in a much better protection system instead of reversing environmental policies.
Right. Mr. Meirowitz, I'd like to jump to you and talk a little about what happened in the G7 summit. Now, President Emmanuel Macron wanted to put this at the top of the agenda, wanted to put pressure on Brazil's government to tackle the issue. They also talked about a possible deal regarding the Amazon. What do you see happening with that?
Well, first of all, to follow up on the last speaker, I don't agree that this is going to be a significant issue going forward on a global issue. It's really, and I hate to use an aphorism, but we're just putting out a fire, if you know what I mean. In other words, this issue is one that has reached the high agenda of the G7. And if you notice, President Trump did not attend the meeting related to this issue, and President Trump also took the United States out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. The problem that we have here is that the world leaders are basically trying to deal with this issue and solve it for Brazil. Whether it becomes a wider issue for the world is really debatable. We have 20% of the world's lungs of the oxygen coming out of the Amazon. This is a major disaster, just like Hurricane Sandy or a major earthquake, but I don't see its global impact. To be candid, also, I don't believe that this is a climate change issue per se. It's really more about, there's a climate change aspect to the impact of the fires, but the fires themselves are destructive, and what they're all about are the problems of the policies of Bolsonaro in favoring particular industries in his country that want to do deforestation in Brazil. So I would debate whether this becomes long-term a global impact. We got to put this out. We have to deal with this right now. But whether it becomes a global issue, I really am really questioning.
Right. Mr. Sullivan, now that's an interesting point that Mr. Meirowitz talked about, that this might not just be about climate or the climate crisis, but it might just be about the policies. Do you agree with that take?
In regards to this, it does fit into a wider narrative which has been sort of dominating the press in the West, which is the climate crisis. And of course, this does, I agree with your first speaker, put a massive spotlight on the issue of the climate crisis. And even those that might have been somewhat skeptical of the more extreme people, such as Extinction Rebellion, the sort of socialist protesters that have been jumped onto this issue. I think seeing the very disturbing pictures of the Amazon on fire is enough to sort of be a call to action for most people. In terms of right now, though, it is also a fire, and it is a fire that needs to be put out. An idea that's gaining a lot of traction at the moment is that of compensation for tropical countries which aren't exploiting, but if we're going to ask them not to exploit their natural resources. The respected comedian and political commentator Bill Maher suggested that either the US government or a consortium of American billionaires actually buy the Amazon, saying to President Trump, who occasionally catches his program, picture the headline, Trump saves the earth. And we had the conversation last week about buying Greenland. Well, there is no greener land than the Amazon. And this, at the end of the day, is about land and about the use of land.
Right.
No less than former United States, North Dakota, Heidi Heitkamp called it a great idea.
Right.
And her opinion was that you have to think about whether Brazil is actually letting this happen so they can deforest the Amazon and therefore develop it.
Mr. Harmeling, now talking about all these countries in the world putting pressure on Brazil right now and talking about how this is ruining the planet Earth, if we talk about all these countries' own stance and what they are doing on the development front. Now, a report released by the EU Commission in 2019 stated that almost in all over EU, the subsidies given for fossil fuels remain the same as 2008. And we know that the EU, along with China and the United States, is responsible for the greatest emissions. Now, it's not like each and every country is playing its own role when it comes to tackling the climate crisis. So why is Brazil getting so much heat for this?
Yeah, I think one needs to be very clear here that the attention at the moment towards the Amazon is because literally it's a burning issue, right? Because these fires have erupted and have been erupted over the last month. But I think it's also very important to make clear that this is not the only issue we need to care about when we want to solve climate change. And of course, there's still a very high responsibility for the G7 and other developing economies or richer countries to get their own house in order. And I think by no way we should now assume that all the G7 leaders who are calling on Brazil to act are now have done their job. And we have the debate in the European Union that Europe must step up its targets. We have it in Germany in particular that the German government has not been responding enough in terms of implementing legislation. So it's not about Brazil only. It's just at this very moment in time, this has kind of exploded. But we are looking into the next couple of weeks of international climate policy discussion. There will be a special UN Climate Action Summit on the 23rd of September, where basically civil society and the UN Secretary General pushed all governments to come to the table with new plans or like how they plan to increase their climate ambition, because the climate crisis is there and the plans are not by far not where we need them to be, and we need to implement much more concrete actions in all of these countries. So it's not Brazil only. I think that's very clear.
Right. Mr. Meirowitz, on that, on another point actually, and now given that we always talk about governments not doing enough, they say a lot, but they don't really do what they're saying. Given the political atmosphere and how important climate has become to the people, to individuals who are being mobilized, who are talking about it, who are protesting regarding it, do you think all these governments, when they come to the table and try to talk about future climate policies, they will now actually do what they say?
Well, I don't want to beat this to death, so to speak, but this has nothing to do with climate change, although it relates to it. In other words, the fires that were set in Brazil are man-made fires. These are deliberately set to clear the forest so that the gold industry and the gold miners and the cattle ranchers will have clear area to graze. The problem is, though, that when this was raised up to the G7 and Macron basically said to Brazil, you're not going to get the deal with Mercosur, with the EU, they raised it up so high and they made it a climate change issue. And remember, President Trump does not believe in climate change. He pulled the United States out of the Paris Accord. Boris Johnson also made the statement that he didn't like the idea of making this into a political football. So I think in the short term, the world is going to get together, even Britain, U.S., are going to help Brazil put the fires out. But long term, I think that this political maneuvering was negative in terms of its impact on the need for climate change policy, which is clearly urgent for the world. But I don't think the Brazil issue is that issue per se, because it's not about fossil fuels, it's not about emissions, it's not about any of that. It's all about man-made fires, which have been encouraged by the policy of Bolsonaro.
Yeah, but they're being encouraged by the policies of Bolsonaro, and his defense is that's being done for development. Now, Brazil does remain to be the largest exporter for things like beef. It is also a very large exporter for sugar, coffee, soybeans. Now, all these developed nations, and as you were rightly mentioning, that this is just political maneuvering, they are counting on Brazil for all of this trade. Now, how does the trade system globally need to be worked if you actually want to move towards sustainable policies when we're talking about the environment?
I don't know if
right.
Yes, okay. So I think that with President Trump in office, I think that these developments will be limited in terms of political moving forward. I mean, you have a president who is not in favor of multilateral negotiation, multilateral problem solving. And therefore, in order to solve these problems, these are global problems. You cannot solve them on a piecemeal basis. They are all about our planet. So I think that is a tremendous, and Boris Johnson wants Trump's help on Brexit. He wants a deal on Brexit. Let's be very practical here. So you have a number of, alliances on both sides, and I think the climate change lobby is going to be hurt by this. The United States pulled out of the Paris Climate Change Accord.
Right. Mr. Meirowitz, hold on to that thought. I do want to jump to Mr. Sullivan here, talk to him about the same thing. When we're talking about trade and the fact that development and the Amazon, going back to the Amazon, how it's being deforestation is taking place at such a rapid pace because of this, the exporting of beef and because of soybeans. Now, how does the trade system globally, in your view, need to be reworked so climate degradation doesn't happen?
Well, just going back to the idea of buying the Amazon, the idea for that basically goes to the idea of compensating farmers, compensating those who live in those communities to basically reforest and develop the Amazon instead of exploiting it. A lot of the West has done very well out of exploiting its own natural resources. And I think Bolsonaro's point is that, well, the people in the north of Brazil deserve that opportunity as well. So that is why there are calls for rich philanthropists to come in and sort of put their money where their mouth is.
But what would happen to Brazil's economy after that?
Well, I mean, it's essentially buying it. So I think Bolsonaro would be quite happy to sort of wash his hands of the responsibility for the Amazon.
But all the cattle grazing, all the raising of this beef, growing of all these soybeans, all these products, that's essentially happening on that land. So that will damage the economy.
And that land would be brought. So it would basically be outbid. And that's the sort of idea that the G7 nations or philanthropists or whoever come in and pay the money, pay over the money that the farmers or who have you would get through exploiting that land. It's the idea of compensating them.
All right. Mr. Harmeling, do you agree with that line of thought? And do you think that the Amazon should be bought by richer nations who will do better to protect it?
Well, I think it's a very delicate matter, and one need to really look into the pros and cons of such a proposal. I think it's definitely clear that there needs to a lot of things need to happen. I think there were years where Brazil made progress in terms of protecting the forest, while at the same time also developing more sustainable agricultural structures. And I think in any case, it's very important to work with the people who live in those spaces. And I mean, I think it's still a diverse economy, but there are still a lot of people who basically depend on the functioning of the Amazon. If you look at it from a broader ecosystem perspective, the climate of the entire region also depends of the Amazon existing. So I think there needs to be a discussion and many discussions for how really to implement the protection that was also in place until a couple of months or years ago. And then there might be roles that also philanthropists can play, but in the end, of course, it's very important to see it see the role of the people who live in those spaces.
Right. And Mr. Harmeling, just on that point as well, since 2016 to 2018, there was a decline in the forest fires in the Amazon. There was a significant decline, actually. From 74,000, they went down to 43,000. And then when Bolsonaro came into power, they shot up 82% to 74,000 almost. Now, could it just be that it's not Brazil that's the problem? It is his government, and there are ways to deal with him in a manner that doesn't mean selling off the Amazon?
I mean, what we did basically can say and have seen from the last years is that it's not so easy to just like judge on an entire country. And I think everyone who followed the global climate discussions, including the role of Brazil, has seen that there's with the new government, there has been a shift in position, and as previous speakers pointed to, this may have created an environment where now more people, unfortunately, feel inclined to start these fires. So I think it's really important to find ways to bring back the positive developments of the last years. But I think, as you related to trade, I think it's also important to see that those countries, including Europe, for example, who buy products from that region, also need to ensure that we invest much more in sustainable agricultural solutions, which are climate smart, and there are many solutions out there, and which are not just like large scale industrial agriculture.
Right. Mr. Sullivan, what are your thoughts to that? Actually, a control on the imports of these more developed nations, for example, the European Union, the United States, they putting pressure on Brazil's government by halting the imports coming in from that place?
Well, yes. I mean, firstly, I mean, all politics is local, and in terms of Macron and Varadkar in Ireland, it's been very good for their local politics. When they threatened to veto the EU-South America free trade deal that is about to go through the European Parliament. And as a result of which, we now have Bolsonaro changing on a dime his policy. We've got 44,000 members of the Brazilian military have now been called in as reinforcement fighters. Brazil's Air Force has now deployed C-130 tankers, streaming out 3,000 gallons of water per airdrop. Bolsonaro is rejecting offers of assistance from the US and other governments, which I think is a mistake, saying his country doesn't need any. But I believe it was the threat to block that important trade deal between the EU and South America that really got him moving. Because this is, at the end of the day, this is all about Bolsonaro's treasury, how much money he's got in his treasury. And if he doesn't want his country being sort of pushed into recession by the sort of more developed economies of Western Europe, the other person, I think, who has had a huge impact, and I think it hasn't been noted enough, is the Pope. Brazil is a deeply religious Roman Catholic country, and the Pope has now intervened, saying these are the vital lungs of the planet, in yesterday's noon prayers at the Vatican. That's an incredible amount of domestic political pressure applied on Bolsonaro.
Right.
So at the end of the day, it's all about what domestic pressure you can apply on him.
Right. On that note, Mr. Pat Sullivan, we're going to end the show. Thank you so much for joining us from London. Thank you, Mr. Mark Meirowitz, for joining us from New York. And thank you so much, Mr. Svein Harmeling, for joining us from Bonn. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.